you are not paranoid. You really are watching a script unfold that would make a Hollywood thriller look like a bedtime story. Tonight, we are dissecting a move so bold, so legally precarious, and so politically charged that it threatens to shatter the very foundations of the American justice system. Is Donald Trump going to use Nicolás Maduro, a man facing a century in prison for narco-terrorism and drug trafficking, to obtain a false confession that whitewashes the events of the 2020 election? This is the question that sent shockwaves through Washington today as Maduro was led into a New York courtroom for his arraignment. The stage was set not by a traditional legal filing, but by a social media post that should haunt every person who believes in the rule of law. Ed Martin, a senior official in the Department of Justice's Weaponization Committee under Pam Bondi, didn't just hint at a conspiracy, he amplified it. He signaled a concept so wild that, if it came from anyone else, we would dismiss it as a fringe QAnon fantasy. But Ed Martin is no fringe player. He is a key architect in the current administration's legal apparatus, the man who was so controversial that his initial nomination for U.S. Attorney was yanked because he couldn't get confirmed. The theory being floated is a high-stakes reverse in strategy. Maduro offers evidence that Venezuelan software flipped votes from Trump to Biden in 2020 in exchange for a plea deal that saves his own skin. This is the resurrection of the Big Lie 2.0, a shocking reversal that brings back the long-debunked claims of Sidney Powell regarding Dominion and Smartmatic systems, claims that were funded by money from Venezuela, Cuba, and China, according to the narrative Trump's circle has pushed for years. But why now? We must look at the logic of Wag the Dog. When a presidency is presiding over a failed economy, the fallout of the Epstein scandal, and domestic policies like tariffs being rejected in the polls, you sometimes have to manufacture a war or a bombshell to rally the troops. By kidnapping Maduro and putting him in a New York jail, Trump isn't just seeking justice, he's potentially seeking a transactional deal to rewrite the history of January 6th. This is what happens when a presidency starts to look like a private business deal where the currency is not money, but political impunity. Is there anyone left who still believes that international justice is driven by morality? Because today we are watching it be converted into a raw, high-stakes marketplace. To understand this crisis, you have to understand the transactional presidency. For Donald Trump, Nicolás Maduro is not just a narco-terrorist facing 100 years in a federal cell. He is a geopolitical asset with a very specific price tag. We are witnessing the ultimate application of the life raft strategy, where the Department of Justice offers a drowning dictator a way out, provided he says exactly what the administration wants to hear. The motivation for Maduro is simple: survival. He is looking at charges of narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, and the use of machine guns that would ensure he dies in an American prison. But Maduro knows Trump. He knows that Trump is a man who values the deal over the doctrine. If Maduro proffers evidence, true or false, that Venezuela interfered in the 2020 election to help Joe Biden, he transforms from a rogue villain into a star witness for the MAGA movement. In this dark web of political theater, a false confession is the ticket to asylum and keeping his stolen millions. If you think this is far-fetched, look at the historical fingerprints. Donald Trump is the same president who allowed the former Honduran president, labeled the #1 trafficker in the Western Hemisphere, to walk out of prison after serving only months of a 45-year sentence. He is the leader who continues to flirt with pardoning Ghislaine Maxwell if he believes it will help him suppress the Epstein scandal. Even the Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega was eventually sprung from jail and given asylum in France. The precedent is clear. In a Trump administration, the rule of law is often secondary to the political win.
I can hardly wait to put forth all the evidence we have collected on Dominion, starting with the fact it was created to produce altered voting results in Venezuela for Hugo Chavez, and then shipped internationally to manipulate votes for purchase in other countries, including this one. It was funded by money from Venezuela and Cuba, and China has a role in it also. We have staggering statistical evidence. We have staggering testimony from witnesses, including one who was personally in briefings when all of this was discussed and planned, beginning with Hugo Chavez and how it was designed there, and then saw it happening in this country. As soon as the state shut down on election night and stopped counting, Those are the states where the most egregious problems occurred. We also need to look at, and we're beginning to collect evidence on the financial interests of some of the governors and secretaries of state who actually bought into the Dominion systems to line their own pockets by getting a voting machine in that would either make sure their election was successful or they got money for their family from it. Well, for fraud this serious, I think even if the states are stupid enough to go ahead and certify the votes where we know the machines were operating and producing altered election results, then they will be set aside by the fraud also. I mean, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of votes. President Trump won this election in a landslide.
But why would Trump take this risk now? Look at the content gap in his domestic narrative. He is presiding over a failed economy, massive layoffs in the steel industry, and polling that shows his tariffs and immigration policies are being rejected by the American public. He needs to wag the dog. He needs a bombshell so massive it obliterates the news cycle and provides a retroactive justification for the January 6th insurrection. If Maduro plays ball, Trump gets to stand before the world and claim he was right all along, effectively kidnapping a foreign leader to save his own domestic reputation. This is the shocking reversal that should keep every constitutional scholar awake at night. When the leader of the free world treats the Department of Justice like a private revenue stream for political capital, the entire Western alliance begins to fracture. Allies like the UK, Canada, and Australia are already watching this with deep suspicion, realizing that if Trump can turn a narco-dictator into a political tool, then no international norm is safe. We are no longer talking about justice, we are talking about a transactional power grab where the truth is the first casualty. Did you truly think the Kraken was dead? Or was it just hibernating, waiting for the perfect geopolitical storm to resurface? Tonight, we are watching the ghost of Sidney Powell return to the halls of the Department of Justice, not as a fringe litigant, but as the blueprint for a federal strategy. To understand why Nicolás Maduro's presence in a New York courtroom is so explosive, you have to look back at the original architecture of the 2020 election conspiracy, the one that claimed all roads lead back to Caracas. The narrative being resurrected is one we've heard before, but never with this much executive power behind it. Sidney Powell's theory, now being signaled by high-ranking DOJ official Ed Martin, claimed that Dominion voting systems were created specifically to produce altered voting results for Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. The big lie wasn't just about local fraud, it was a tale of international sabotage funded by money from Venezuela, Cuba, and China. They alleged software was shipped to the United States to flip votes from Trump to Biden, a claim that every major intelligence agency and the FBI has spent years debunking. Yet Ed Martin, the man currently leading the charge against the administration's political enemies, is amplifying this exact concept, just as Maduro faces trial. This isn't just about crackpot theories anymore. It's about a shocking reversal, where a narco-dictator is squeezed to provide staggering statistical evidence that Trump actually won the 2020 election in a landslide. If Maduro prospers this testimony, it provides the perfect whitewash for the events of January 6th. If the election was truly interfered with by a foreign power like Venezuela, then in the minds of this administration, the insurrection wasn't a crime. It was a defense of sovereignty. This is the ultimate information gap strategy. By feeding the public a narrative that links a high-profile criminal, Maduro, with a domestic political trauma, the 2020 election, the administration creates a curiosity loop that most viewers cannot resist. They are gambling that you will believe Maduro's confession because he is a bad guy who finally admitted the truth, ignoring the fact that a man facing life in prison will say anything for a deal. This is a tail-wagging the dog maneuver of historic proportions. While the news cycle is consumed by Venezuelan conspiracies, the public stops asking about the failed domestic economy, the Epstein files, or the institutional disarray within the DOJ itself. We are witnessing the weaponization of a debunked conspiracy to protect the highest levels of power. Meet the man in the trench coat, the shadow operative who is turning the Department of Justice into a personal detective agency for the MAGA movement. To understand how a narco-dictator like Nicolás Maduro becomes a star witness, you have to look at the man pulling the strings behind the curtain, Ed Martin. If you haven't heard his name yet, you need to pay attention, because he is currently the head of the Weaponization Committee under Pam Bondi, and his fingerprints are all over this Venezuelan reversal. Ed Martin is not your typical government official. He is a veteran of the MAGA legal trenches. Before being brought into the DOJ, he was a high-profile January 6th defense lawyer, representing those involved in the very events this administration is now trying to whitewash. His rise to power was anything but conventional. He was initially elevated to be the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, but his views were so extreme and his reputation so nuts that his nomination had to be pulled. Instead of being sidelined, however, he was sucked back into the system as a minister without portfolio, reporting directly to Pam Bondi to lead the charge against the administration's political rivals. Perhaps the most bizarre chapter in Martin's career, one that earned him the nickname Inspector Gadget, occurred in August, when he was spotted marching around Brooklyn in a trench coat like a low-budget detective. His mission? Effectively stalking and doxing New York Attorney General Letitia James, trying to see where she lived as part of a targeted campaign against her office. This is the man now floating the Maduro conspiracy theories. Just hours before Maduro's arraignment, Martin amplified a post suggesting Maduro would plead to lesser charges by offering evidence that the 2020 election was stolen. By adding a simple exclamation mark to this post on his private account, Martin used his authority to legitimize a crackpot theory in the eyes of the MAGA base. This is the ultimate personalization of the DOJ. It's no longer about objective justice, it's about a hand-picked team of trial fighters who treat the news cycle as a battlefield. By having a senior official like Martin keep these theories alive in the media, the administration successfully steps on the news cycle, creating 340 days of headlines that distract from the Epstein scandal or the disarray in domestic policy. Ed Martin isn't just a lawyer. He's an invisible assassin of institutional norms, ensuring that the Maduro narrative stays front and center to serve the president's political survival. How do you lead the free world when your closest friends and oldest allies start treating you like a rogue regime? Tonight, we aren't just looking at a courtroom drama in New York. We are witnessing a tectonic fracture in the Western alliance that has stood since the end of World War II. While the MAGA base cheers for a potential Maduro confession, the intelligence services in London, Ottawa, and Canberra are doing something truly unprecedented. They are turning off the faucet. When your allies decide to hold back intelligence from Washington, it isn't a diplomatic snub, it is a survival move. The shocking reversal in Trump's DOJ strategy has sent a clear message to the Five Eyes community. Under this administration, intelligence is transactional. Our allies are watching the kidnapping of Nicolás Maduro and the subsequent floating of election conspiracies not as a pursuit of justice but as a Wag the Dog maneuver designed to serve a domestic political agenda. They see a presidency so entangled with alleged foreign payments and conflicts of interest that they can no longer trust the commander-in-chief with their most sensitive secrets. The fear is no longer abstract. It is a direct concern that shared intelligence regarding Russia or China could be traded or leaked to serve a private business deal disguised as a presidency. We have moved from being the chief architect of global sanctions, the country that punished dictators and oligarchs, to being the target of our own tools. For the first time in history, historical partners like the EU, Canada, and Australia are weighing sanctions against American interests because they believe our institutions can no longer restrain our leader. They have watched the U.S. Congress remain paralyzed and the courts move at a glacial pace, and they have concluded that the guardrails of American democracy are simply not working. This isn't just a snub, it's a verdict on what America has become in 2026. The real danger here isn't just that the alliance is cracking, it's that the United States is becoming a risk factor in the global order. If allies like Canada and the UK believe that Washington will squeeze a narco-dictator for a false political confession to whitewash a domestic insurrection, they have no choice but to redraw the map without us. We are watching the credit score of American institutional trust plummet in real time. When the orchestra of the democratic world decides to turn down the volume on the person holding the microphone, the stage is set for a global realignment that could leave America permanently isolated. If you think the political fallout is messy, wait until you see the carnage on the trading floors. While Washington plays Wag the Dog with a narco-dictator, Wall Street is beginning to realize that the price of this political theater might be paid in the currency of American economic stability. Investors hate uncertainty, and there is nothing more uncertain than a Department of Justice that functions like a pawnshop for political favors. We have to ask, What happens to the global markets when the world's largest oil-producing apparatus becomes a hostage to a domestic election conspiracy? The Trump administration's move to decapitate the Maduro regime and take over the oil-producing infrastructure of Venezuela isn't just a military or legal maneuver, it's an economic gamble of terrifying proportions. For decades, the global energy market has relied on a predictable, if strained, flow of resources. Now, by bringing Maduro to New York to squeeze him for a confession, the administration has injected a massive dose of volatility into the energy sector. We are seeing the transaction cost of this presidency rise in real time. If the U.S. can simply kidnap a foreign leader and seize an entire nation's oil assets to serve a political narrative, then the concept of sovereign risk has been completely redefined for every multinational corporation on the planet. But the trembling isn't just about oil, it's about the integrity of the U.S. dollar. Wall Street is watching a presidency that is presiding over a failing economy, where domestic policies like tariffs and immigration are already being rejected by the American people in the polls. When the Department of Justice begins prioritizing crackpot theories over the rule of law, the world begins to question the stability of the American financial system itself. We are witnessing a crisis of confidence where institutional trust, the very thing that gives the dollar its value, is being traded away for a short-term news cycle win. The market shock we are anticipating is a direct result of this institutional disarray. If Maduro is offered a deal to walk free in exchange for validating the big lie, the signal to global investors is clear. Contracts, laws, and treaties in the United States are now subject to the whims of the executive branch. This is what happens when a country starts to look less like a superpower and more like a private business deal gone wrong. As the news of the Maduro arraignment broke, the markets began to price in the risk of a legal system that is no longer predictable, creating a power grab narrative that is scaring away the very capital that is supposed to keep the U.S. economy afloat. Do you believe the walls of a federal courtroom are thick enough to block out the political winds blowing from the White House? Tonight, we are reaching the most critical junction of this crisis, the moment where the transactional presidency meets the immovable object of the American judicial system. As Nicolás Maduro stood before a judge in New York for his arraignment, the atmosphere wasn't just tense, it was a constitutional stress test in real time. We have to ask, can a judge stop the Department of Justice from manufactured evidence if the price of that evidence is a plea deal for a narco-dictator? The scene inside the courtroom was a stark contrast to the loud, conspiracy-laden social media posts of Ed Martin. Nicolás Maduro, the man Trump's circle is flirting with for a confession, didn't come in as a cooperative witness, he came in as a defiant political actor. He described himself as a kidnapped president, a narrative that immediately clashed with the reality of the federal marshals and the legal protocols of the Southern District of New York. When Maduro made his political speech claiming his legitimacy, the tension boiled over. A man in the courtroom, Pedro Rojas, shouted back in Spanish, "Never," and "illegitimate." This outburst is the physical manifestation of the chaos that ensues when the executive branch tries to rewrite legal reality to suit a political narrative. The real bombshell here isn't what happened in the gallery, but what is happening in the prosecutor's files. If the DOJ, under the influence of the Weaponization Committee, presents a plea deal where Maduro admits to 2020 election interference in exchange for immunity, the court becomes the final guardrail. We are looking at a potential power grab where the executive branch attempts to use the judicial system to retroactively validate a debunked conspiracy theory. Legal experts are already warning of a constitutional crisis if the administration tries to bypass standard evidentiary rules to secure this confession. The courts are supposed to be the check and balance on executive overreach, but in 2026 those checks are being pushed to their absolute breaking point. This is the ultimate cover-up mechanism. If the courts allow a transactional confession from a man facing life in prison for narco-terrorism, they are essentially signaling that the truth is whatever the highest bidder says it is. This isn't just a legal debate, it is a fight for the soul of the American institution. While Donald Trump uses the news cycle to step on the daily headlines, the career prosecutors and federal judges are facing a choice. Do they uphold the law as written, or do they become props in a Wag the Dog geopolitical thriller? The sovereignty of the American legal system is on the line, and the world is watching to see if the guardrails will hold or if they will buckle under the weight of this shocking reversal. We are at the precipice of a choice that will define the next century of American governance, and the stakes could not be higher. Tonight, we conclude our deep dive into the shocking reversal of the Trump DOJ's strategy involving Venezuela. We have to ask the final, most haunting question: what is the true cost of trading the rule of law for a political whitewash? If Nicolás Maduro, a man the U.S. government has labeled a narco-terrorist, is allowed to walk free in exchange for validating the 2020 election conspiracy, we are no longer a nation of laws. We are a nation of transactions. The endgame for this administration is clear: control the news cycle, neutralize the January 6th narrative, and provide a retroactive justification for a power grab. By turning a rogue dictator into a star witness, they are attempting to institutionalize a debunked conspiracy theory at the highest levels of the federal government. But as we've analyzed, this strategy has already triggered a Five Eyes fracture and a market shock that the American economy may not be able to withstand. When our closest allies in London, Ottawa, and Canberra stop sharing intelligence because they no longer trust the person holding the microphone in Washington, the sovereignty of the United States is effectively diminished on the global stage. The real danger is not that Donald Trump will survive this legal storm, it is that the idea of America as the trusted anchor of the democratic world will not survive his presidency. We are watching a Wag the Dog maneuver of historic proportions, designed to distract from the Epstein scandal, a failing economy, and domestic policy failures. If the Department of Justice is successfully converted into a private tool for political impunity, the guardrails we have relied on for over 200 years will have officially collapsed. The market verdict is already coming in, with investors pricing in the risk of a legal system that is no longer predictable, but purely transactional. As we watch this constitutional thriller unfold in a New York courtroom, the choice remains with the institutions and the people. Will the courts maintain their integrity, or will they become a life raft for a transactional presidency? This isn't just a story about a narco-dictator and a 2020 conspiracy. It is a stress test for the entire Western alliance. The ultimate price of this whitewashing may be the permanent loss of American leadership in the free world. Is the survival of one political cycle worth the collapse of the global order? That is the question we must all answer before the news cycle moves on again.